following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Since early December, Phillies fans have been hearing rumors that General Manager Matt Klentak has been talking with the Chicago Cubs about third baseman Kris Bryant. Yes, that Kris Bryant, a three-time All-Star who was the 2015 National League Rookie of the Year, the same guy who was the 2016 NL MVP and who helped the Cubs win a World Championship by hitting .269 with a pair of solo home runs in the series. Because Bryant recently lost his playing time grievance against the Cubs, he won't be a free agent until 2021 rather than at the end of the upcoming season. That has created such a divide between the Cubby third baseman and the organization that the trade market is heating up. Or is it? Theo Epstein of the Cubs, the general manager, recently said that there is going to be no more entertaining trade talks with about Bryant, or at least until the July trading deadline. And then we'll see where we are. No matter, the Phillies are rumored to be one of the top suitors for Bryant. On this podcast, we will explore the possibility of a trade for Kris Bryant. Among the issues are, what other clubs are competing with the Phillies for Bryant's services? Which players and or prospects would the Fightins have to give up to get him? And is Philadelphia a good fit for Bryant? My guest is Chicago Cubs historian Bill Vaselopulos, who is also a long-suffering Cubs fan. Lopo had to wait a little over a half a century for his Cubs to finally capture a World Series, but as he knows, being a Phillies fan isn't much better. I'm just fortunate that the Phillies captured both of their World Championships in my lifetime. Who could ask for more? Welcome to the podcast, Lopo. Great to have you.
Thanks, Cash. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, Bill, I know you've been keeping close tabs on the Bryant situation. Tell us, why do the Cubs now find themselves locked in a battle with a star player who was once considered an indispensable part of their future?
Well, I would characterize it maybe a little bit differently than that. On the surface, it appears that way, that the grievance may have caused a rift between the Cubs and Bryant. But I think, although that is an issue, the Cubs were following the letter of the law, and Bryant did lose his grievance. They may have violated the spirit of the law because they activated him the day after the cutoff for arbitration for one more year had occurred. And clearly there was a need for him, a guy who not only had the accolades that you mentioned, but going back, had 4 MVPs in a row, college MVP, minor league MVP, and then Rookie of the Year, which is in essence kind of an MVP award, and then the MVP itself in 2016. Coming into that 2015 year, he tore it up in the spring, was really deserving of the third base starting job, but they sent him to the minors for a couple of weeks until that deadline had passed. So yes, there was some animosity. Keep in mind, his agent is Scott Boras, and that, along with the payroll situation that the Cubs are facing over the next 2 years, is more a reason why they're looking to trade Bryant. Or let me put it to you differently. While they are looking to see how much they can get for Bryant, and if they can really get a major haul for him, they will do it. And I think that's what they attempted to do over the winter. I don't think there were a lot of takers because of the grievance, which was up in the air, determining whether he'd be a free agent after this year or next year. Now that that's settled, his trade value really has gone up even more. The Cubs, I think, are waiting to see if they're going to get blown away with an offer. They, in my opinion, or I think if my theory is right, they haven't yet. And so Theo Epstein was asked just 2 days ago what the status is, and he didn't mention Bryant by name, but he did say that I think we're going to hold pat right now, and we're looking to tweak this current roster, meaning make some fine-tune adjustments and to be competitive this year and keep the star players on the team as of now. There's one other element to this, and that is in 2 years from now, they are going to have their top 6 players all coming up and available for free agency. They cannot pay all 6 of them. They're going to have to trade one of them to get something in return. They're starting with Bryant because he can probably yield the biggest return. If that doesn't work, they're going to probably go down the line with Schwarber or Contreras. One of those guys won't be on the team in another 2 years. Maybe 2 of those guys won't be because there's just not enough money to go around.
Mm-hmm. Well, here in Philly, landing Bryant would make up for what has been a disappointing offseason for the fans. After the Phillies hired Joe Girardi as their manager and then signed starting pitcher Zach Wheeler and shortstop Didi Gregorius in early December, Klentak did very, very little. In fact, he appeared to be focused on staying under MLB's luxury tax threshold rather than improving the roster. Many fans were hoping that Klentak would have gone after starting pitching, which obviously is the Phillies' greatest need. So I'm not quite sure the third base is as pressing a need. After you get past Aaron Nola and Zach Wheeler, there's not much to the rotation. Vince Velasquez was a bust last year. Zach Eflin was also a disappointment, though he pitched better in the second half of the season when he stopped listening to the Phillies' pitching coach, Chris Young, who has since departed. And then, of course, there's Jake Arrieta, who did not prove to be the success we had hoped for the last 2 years. You predicted that, I think, on an earlier podcast. Going into the season, Arrieta is looking like a back-of-the-rotation pitcher, like number 5 back of the rotation. So, Bill, if you were the Phillies, would you focus on Bryant or improving a very questionable starting rotation?
Well, my personal philosophy is always to focus on rotation first and try to plug in your weaknesses in other ways, offensive weaknesses with other ways, throughout the season or the off season. Pitching depth is huge, and most teams that go far in the playoffs, they've got at least three stud pitchers, if not 4, and maybe even 5. So, starting rotation, I think, is key. Now, that's no slight against Bryant. I mean, Bryant is a tremendous individual in the clubhouse, is a great player, and what a lot of people overlook is his flexibility. You can plug him in 4 different positions on the field. Actually, in his first couple of years, he actually played 5 positions. He played the corner outfields, corner infields, and he played center field, too, a little bit. Center field may be a stretch now, but he can play all 4 positions defensively relatively well. He'll never be a Golden Glove player, maybe at any position, including third base, but he won't be a hindrance. He won't be a liability in any of those positions. That's a tremendous asset to have for in a star player, and I think that's overlooked a little bit. So it's a tough call, but I've always liked starting pitching before anything else. And, looking at your roster, you've got 2 really good starting pitchers, and after that it does drop off tremendously.
Now, there's an interesting parallel between Kris Bryant and one of his closest friends, Bryce Harper, who, of course, is our franchise player. Bryant, like Harper, hasn't done much to live up to the superstar status that they came into the league with. As you know, Harper was the, NL MVP in 2015, I guess it was.
Not 2015.
it was maybe it was 2012, 2013. But he really hasn't done much since then. Bryant has not really lived up to his billing either after those first 2 years, although he did come back with a productive season last year after a really bad 2018 campaign. So if Brian comes to Philadelphia, it'd be a real pick-me-up for Harper, and maybe the two of them could figure something out because they would become a threatening 3-4 punch in the lineup. Undoubtedly, Bryant would be the cleanup hitter if he came here. At first glance, Bryant would resolve some of the Phillies' infield problems if he came. As you know, we've moved on from Maikel Franco, who after several seasons showed his unrealized potential. Scott Kingery is a rising star. He's been playing third base but also the outfield. Neither of those are his natural position. He's a second baseman. But right now, Kingery is slated to open the season at third base because of the acquisition of shortstop Didi Gregorius, which has shifted Gene Segura from shortstop to second base. But if the Phillies traded Segura as part of a package to the Cubs for Bryant, which I think would be a necessity, Kingery could return to his natural position. On the other hand, and I don't like this scenario, the Phillies have Alex Baum, their top draft pick in 2018, who's waiting in the wings to play third base. And the kid refined his abilities at Wichita State. Last year was his first full season in pro ball, and he was successful at all three levels of the minors, hitting a combined .305 with 21 homers and 80 RBI. He also has a 57-73 walk-to-strikeout ratio, which is ridiculous for a power hitter. Many of us feel that he will make his appearance in Philadelphia sometime this season if he's not traded, and he would stay for good. Of course, any trade for Bryant will most likely include Baum because the Phillies farm system is pretty barren. I'm just not sure Bryant is worth giving up Baum, despite everything you said about his value. What kind of package of veterans and prospects will the Phillies have to offer if they want Bryant?
I think what the Cubs are attempting to do is to shop Bryant around to get an outrageously good package for him. So I would imagine, and I think the rumors were that initial conversations had occurred between the Cubs and the Phils, and then they broke off. And my guess is the reason for that is the Cubs asked for Bohm, asked for your top pitching prospect, Spencer Howard, and someone like Kingery or something like that, a player that would play every day, waiting for Bohm to come up in a year or so. The Cubs also have another third baseman on their roster, David Bodie, who would plug in there too. They like someone like Kingery because he could play multiple infield positions and center field too, and he's pretty cheap. Money is a big part of this deal. They are trying to shed or create cap space in the future because they've got 6 guys they're going to have to pay. Then they can't pay them all. They've got a huge amount of money coming in from the renovated Wrigley Field and also the new TV marquee network that they are opening up in like 2 weeks. Large sums of money, and everyone is like, well, why aren't the Cubs spending more or able to spend more? There are, I think, a couple of reasons for that. One, the rehabilitation of Wrigley Field cost hundreds of millions of dollars more than they had budgeted, so they're going to have to pay that debt off, an unexpected amount. It was supposed to be $500 million, and it ended up being over $700 million. And secondly, as I said earlier, you've got their top 6 offensive players, Rizzo, Baez, Bryant, Schwarber, Contreras, all are coming up in the next 2 years. I think they've made a decision that they're going to keep Rizzo and they're going to keep Baez. So that leaves 3 more guys, Bryant, Schwarber, Contreras. They're not going to be able to keep all 3. At the initial stages of this of this turnaround for the Cubs organization, they thought Rizzo and Bryant were going to be the juggernauts. I still think they would like to see that happen. But Baez has stepped in and has really become a fan favorite. You mentioned Bryant's lack of production in the last 2 years. That is directly attributed to injuries. In 2018, he had 2 different stints on the DL with a shoulder problem. And last year, he didn't go on the DL, but he had a bad knee problem that was bothering him the second half of the season, and then turned his ankle in September, which kind of knocked him out for the rest of the season. So his numbers are low because of that. But if positioned, on the right team, in the right lineup, and not batting second like he would normally, like he has been doing with the Cubs over the last 4 or 5 years, his RBIs would go over 100 per year on a regular basis if he's batting with Harper. One interesting point about Harper, when Harper was a free agent, there was strong, because of the close bond between Harper and Bryant, there was strong sentiment here in Chicago that Harper would be coming to Chicago. Right. That Bryant would woo him to bring him to Chicago. That Hayward, they got a problem in center field, so Hayward would move to center field. Harper would play right field, and the Cubs would be a juggernaut. This was the first indication. Apparently, there was no even sense that was going to happen within the Cubs front office. And it was the first indication that the Cubs were very money conscious. I mean, they are still a top 5 salary team, but they do not want to go over that salary luxury cap threshold like a couple teams do go over. They don't want to touch that at all, and that's been very evident over the last 2 years. You talk about getting Wheeler and Gregorius. Cubs have done nothing this offseason. And last offseason did absolutely nothing because of these money problems that they're having. That's quite evident now. At first, people were like, "Oh, they're playing coy." Apparently, that's not the case. They do not want to spend over the luxury cap, and they've got a lot of other expenses that they have to take care of and future planning. So they would need a big haul, and I think that's what's going on. They didn't get it. Right now, they're now saying they're going to focus on the upcoming season. And, I mean, maybe that it could be a negotiating ploy to make that statement, but I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised either way if they traded them now in a spring training move, or wait to see where the Cubs are going to be during the season. And as the trading deadline approaches, if their playoff hopes are dashed and they're not doing well, they will probably look to trade him again. The converse, though, is if they're doing okay and they got a new manager that needs to kind of kick everyone in the rear end to pick up their production, that is the problem that has occurred over the last 2 or 3 years with the Cubs. They've kind of rested on their laurels, and Joe Maddon let them rest on their laurels. That all came out just actually in the last week. With a couple of conversations Madden's been having, and then Epstein kind of countering that. They're still on friendly terms, but some of the behind the scenes is now starting to come forward. And if the Cubs continue to languish and not reach their potential, you will see some trades at the trading deadline, if not before.
Well, as you know, money is not an issue with the Phillies, particularly with its the presiding partner, John Middleton, who had said he was going to spend stupid money last offseason, which he did, and will continue, I'm sure, to spend stupid money for players. How wisely remains to be seen. And I do want to get to the money issue later, but I still want to stick with, what would the price be for Bryant? Now you
right now
you pronounced his you pronounced from the Phillies. You pronounced Alex. He's been called Bohm and Bond, and usually the case with these players is that you don't know how their names are really pronounced until they make it to the majors. So let's go with Bohm for now, so we're both on the same page. Bohm is going to be the centerpiece of whatever trade is involved for Bryant, obviously because the Cubs are going to need a third baseman. We got right-hander Spencer Howard, who's projected to be a frontline starter if he can remain healthy, and Adonis Medina, a power pitcher who also has an impressive slider. So some combination of Howard and Bohm or Medina and Bohm are going to be at least the prospects, I believe, involved. And my guess is that they're also going to have to package some veterans. Gene Segura, there will be no place for him if they want to keep Kingery because he'll have to go to second base. Segura will stay if they part with Kingery. And/or Adam Hazley, who, just came up last year, and in 67 games, he hit .266 with 5 homers and 26 RBIs. The kid can play center field, so he has a future. But any way you cut it, the Phillies are going to have to give the Cubs a third baseman to replace Bryant, because I think the only player that Chicago has who can possibly fill that gap and offer the kind of hitting that they're going to need is Nico Horner, who's a shortstop and their 2018 first-round pick. So am I right about this assumption that whatever the Phillies give, if they trade for Bryant, it's going to have to include Bohm as well as a veteran like Segura and Kingery?
Yeah, absolutely. Nico Horner, you mentioned, he is being targeted now more for second base. They have a gaping hole at second base. They just signed a couple days ago Jason Kipnis to gap that hole until Nico Horner is ready. He came up last year in August and September and really did well. I think they're going to send him to the minors, have him play second base, and you're right, he's more of a shortstop, but have him play second base. He did in September last year, but give him more seasoning at second base, and also try him out at leadoff spot. The Cubs have had, ever since Dexter Fowler left, have had a big hole at the leadoff spot. Maybe he can fill that leadoff position and then come up during the year and play second base. Third base, they've got David Bodie, who's serviceable, but they will want a professional third baseman to fill. I'm looking at Kingery, I'm looking at Segura, and the price tag on those two are dramatically different. Kingery is locked in $1,750,000 this year, and then $4 million, $6 million, $8 million for the next 3 years. Segura is $14 million for the next 3 years. So that's a tremendous difference. Cubs aren't looking, because Bryant is going to be $18 million this year.
Mm-hmm.
Trading Bryant, and then next year would be $20, $21 million, and then he'd be a free agent and get over $30 million a year probably.
Right.
If they trade Bryant at $18 million and then $20 million for 2 years and replace him with Segura at $14 million, that's not a big savings in their eyes. They would rather go with Kingery in terms of just the money. Now, Segura, he has a better track record. He's more established. Kingery is much younger, another attraction. Maybe he has a greater upside. It kind of depends. But especially if Kingery is more flexible, Kingery can play center field too. So I think they would go for Kingery. But in terms of the minor leaguers, I'm pretty sure the Cubs started asking for both of them. And that's why the Phillies said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to wait and see. Maybe the price will come down later in the year. It typically would, right? But then you run the risk of more competition, either now or later in the year. Atlanta has some needs, and they're a contending team. The Nationals lost arguably their best player last year, Rendon, third baseman. So they've got some needs if they want to stay competitive. So there are other teams out there. And who knows? They may blow the Cubs away, and Bryant's gone next week to some of the, your other competitors in the National League East. Got to be careful there. So I think the Cubs are just waiting for the best deal possible, and if they don't get it, they love Bryant. It's not so much they don't have a difficult relationship with him. It's more money more than anything else.
There's one other interesting development here, and if the Phillies could manage to get Bryant without giving up Bohm, they'll do it, because last year, and this is very interesting, they started playing in the minors, they started playing Bohm periodically at first base. And Rhys Hoskins had a terrible, terrible second half last year. And a lot of people are wondering, is he the real deal? He's the current Phillies first baseman. It could be that if the Phillies are willing to give up, let's say, Spencer Howard, Adonis Medina, and Scott Kingery, and a lot of money, that and keep Bohm, that, Bryant and Bohm would be playing on the opposite ends of the diamond next year. So that would be interesting.
It could be, because, Hoskins, in addition to maybe tailing off a little bit, he's still very valuable, because he's got like 3 years, 4 years, I think, of arbitration left.
Right.
So he's still valuable, but he may be in the position that Bryant is in now in a couple of years. He happens to be Scott Boras' client also. And people don't want to mess with Scott Boras. So in a year or 2 or 3, Hoskins may be on the trading deadline, especially if he, maintains some of the production that he's done in the past, because you can't keep all these guys. Even if you have all the money in the world, unless you're willing to go over the luxury cap, which is, as that cap, that penalty really steps up. Year 1 is manageable. Year 2, it gets really really difficult. Year 3 is crazy. And there's only 1 or 2 teams. I think it's the Yankees and the Red Sox that went over the luxury cap last year. Everyone else was at it or just under it.
And now, as you know, the Red Sox are trying to make up for that. They just got rid of Betts. That's coming home to roost with them right now. I'm looking, as you mentioned, some of the competitors for Bryant in the National League East, and the one thing the Phillies do have over them, because they're the Nationals and the Braves, the leveraging factor would be the money. Now, the National League East is slated to be one of the most competitive in baseball, with the Nationals and the Braves at the top. So the Phillies really cannot afford to allow Bryant to go to one of those teams. It would hurt their chances of making the playoffs. The Nationals, as you've already said, just lost Anthony Rendon to the L.A. Angels, and they paid an ungodly amount of money to keep Strasburg. And that they just allowed Rendon to walk. So I think, I don't think Bryant would stay there even if he was traded there, because I just don't see them having the money. The Braves are also in a win-now mode. Their third baseman, Josh Donaldson, is now a Minnesota Twin. That Marcell Ozuna deal wasn't so big that the Braves should stop spending money, and they could afford, and this is where they offer tough competition to Phillies, they could afford to send a package centered around third baseman Austin Riley and several of their young major league ready pitchers. But, the Phillies have more money than they do. Now, stepping outside of the National League East, you have other teams who could enter the Bryant sweepstakes, including the Colorado Rockies, who could probably swap Nolan Arenado straight up for Bryant, especially if Arenado is angry and he wants out of Colorado. I think anyone would love to play for the Cubs, and Bryant would likely welcome playing half his home games in Coors Field for 2 years before heading into free agency. And we already talked this, it seems like the Cubs are interested in keeping Bryant at least until the July trading deadline, if they're no longer in the chase at that period of time. What it's going to come down to, though, even then, is who's going to give him the best package of players. So we're kind of agreed on that. But whoever gets Bryant in a trade is going to have to pay him dearly. As you already said, he's set to make $18.6 million this coming season. That'll go well over $20 million in 2021, his final arbitration go-round. Plus, as you said correctly, his agent is Scott Boras, who raped the Phillies of $330 million for Bryce Harper. Although some crazy fans still think that that's a suitable price, and I think it remains to be seen if anybody, let alone Harper, is worth that kind of money. Stay tuned. Where do you think the money is going to go with Bryant? I mean, how much more money do you think he'll command than, let's say, a Harper, or Trout even? I mean, I don't see him in the same.
It depends. His unfortunately injuries have, and his position is in the batting lineup, have hindered his RBI production. If you look at the last couple of years, his RBI production has been, what is it? It's he had 77 RBIs last year with bad knees. The year before with a bad shoulder, being on the DL a couple times, he only had 52 RBIs. The year before that, he had 73 RBIs. Now, his home run production is still hovering around 30 per year. So that's pretty good. If you move him off the number 2 spot in the batting order and you have a proper leadoff hitter in front and slide him down to number 3 or 4 in the order with good leadoff hitters and good number 2 hitter, his RBI production will go up. My point is, he is a 30 home run, 100 RBI guy. I think you can project him that out. He's a top 5 third baseman. And those guys are getting $30+ million a year. For him, he's going to be about, how old is he? He's going to be about 20. He's 28 years old, or about to turn 28. So 2 more years will be 30. So probably sign for 7, maybe 8 years, $30 million a year, and that's in 2 years. So who knows? Maybe it's $35 million at that point. You raised Arenado. He's the gold standard right now at third base because of his defense. I mean, his offense is through the roof. You could say, okay, he's at Coors Field, and that pads his stats. I think most people agree to that. But still, he is, I think, probably considered the best third baseman in baseball, even though he's played at Coors Field, in part because he's probably the best defensive third baseman in baseball, too. And that's a rarity, to have the best offensive and defensive third baseman in one player. And he's making about $30 million a year. So I think that's the going price. It's interesting pairing him, going back to that Harper thing. The wives are very friendly with each other. The 4 of them vacation together and socialize together during the off season. I don't know how much that will play. The trade is the trade. Wherever he goes, he can't control that too much. But whether he decides to re-sign with the Phillies, if he's traded with the Phillies for a long-term contract, familiarity with Harper could help with that decision. But it's a tough one. It's a tough one. If you asked me if we would have this conversation 4 years ago, I'd tell you you're absolutely crazy. Right. Bryant and Rizzo were packaged by the Cubs as this 1-2 punch, cornerstone infielders that would be on the team for 10 years. I mean, no one ever said that, but that was how they were packaged. Advertising, they did a lot of promotions together. I mean, they were going to be the next best thing since, Ernie Banks and Billy Williams, going way back, or Ryan Sandberg and Andre Dawson or something like that. They were being advertised that way by the Cubs. Now they've got Baez, who's a different kind of guy, but very, very attractive to the fan base. They love him too. And as I said before, I think it's a money situation. They can't keep them all. They're just throwing Bryant out there now. Let's see if we can basically steal a whole bunch of prospects and players from a team. If someone's stupid enough to give them all that they want, they may go for it. If not, they may keep Bryant when it's all said and done, and then try to trade Contreras or Schwarber, who are also going to put up some good numbers here in their careers. But as I said, the Cubs are not going to be able to keep them all. So in a way, I guess it's a nice problem to have. But from the Cubs' perspective, they got to get these guys kind of reaching their full potential in order to be successful.
I would like to remind you of something, Bill. After the 2018 season, I raised the possibility of the Phillies going after Bryant. Now, this is before, Bohm became as successful in the minors as he was, because we had Franco, who just was painful to watch play. And it was clear that the Phillies needed a third baseman. And my prediction started heating up last baseball season, when the early part of the season, Bryant was struggling. And you still told me I was crazy after the 2018 season, but I don't sound as crazy now, do I?
No, you don't. I'm sure I told you were crazy. They would never trade him because of the way they were packaging him, the way they felt he was a keeper for years and years and years. We'll see. They may still not trade him. They may still want to keep him, but that will be to sacrifice a couple of other players. And what hasn't been discussed here is, they made a mistake in terms of the money that they spent on Jason Hayward. That is kind of an anchor, a drag down on the salary cap. He's a great guy and a great defensive player, but just, adequate at the plate. And for the money that they're paying for him, he's not living up to that contract. So that and a few other contracts that are out there. I remember one other thing you said, going back to earlier in this conversation about pitching. The Cubs will want, in addition to that starting third baseman, will want a projected starter pitcher because they've got two of their current starters that are going to be free agents after this year. John Lester, and Jose Quintana are both free agents after this year. So they're going to have some holes. And the one thing the Cubs have been bad at is drafting and developing starting pitching. They've started to do that in the last two drafts, but the first 6-7 drafts under Theo Epstein has all been offense. That was by design. Their philosophy was load up on minor league hitters. They are more predictable in terms of their success when they reach the majors than starting pitching. That's their philosophy. And that they would go to free agency for starting pitching, or through trades, which is what they did when they won the championship. Well, those free agent pitchers, Quintana and Lester, are coming to the end of their contracts. So Cubs have to fill those voids too. So, it'll be interesting to see what plays out.
Well, the thing is, the Phillies really can't afford to get rid of Spencer Howard or Adonis Medina. They like Chicago, they have never developed great starting pitching in the minor leagues. So they really can't afford it. I don't think they could afford to get rid of Bohm. So I mean, there's a big part of me that hopes that Bryant never lands in Philadelphia because the price is going to be just too dear to pay. Now I look at the Cubs. They have Braylon Marquez. They have Corey Abbott. They got Ryan Jensen. Cole Franklin, and Richard Gallardo, all in the minor leagues, who are pretty much among their top 10 prospects. I'd like to see another name up there, Brendan Little. But Brendan, I think, is going to be starting at in High A. Yeah, Myrtle.
Beach.
In High A Myrtle. And hopefully, he'll end the season in Iowa. But that remains to be seen. He's a power pitcher. They want him to be a starter. I think he'd probably get to the majors faster if they moved him to relief, but that's not in their plans for him. But at least you got more in terms of pitching in the pipeline than the Phillies do. So, and we have no third baseman aside from Bohm in the organization.
So what you're saying
right.
is, if the Phillies, go for Bryant, they're all in. I mean, they're going to have to win it because there's nothing coming up. A little bit about what's happened with the Cubs in terms of their trades. They made 2 or 3 trades trading huge, big prospects for guys to win it in 2016. The one that comes to mind is Aroldis Chapman.
Right.
And
who turned around and went back to New York.
Yeah. So we got a World Series out of it. We got him for whatever it was, 3 months. We got a World Series out of it, and we lost, maybe one of the best shortstops and best shortstop prospects in all of baseball, who is now killing it for the Yankees, and they got Chapman back. So it's a weird kind of business. It really is, and who knows? Maybe you play this out as is. You could strike it. Someone could get hot at third base, and you don't, and then you just wait till the trading deadline and then plug in whatever weaknesses you have at the trading deadline. I mean, that's another strategy as opposed to going all in now and really decimating your minor leagues for the foreseeable future.
Well, I just hope this isn't another Jonathan Papelbon move, who was a luxury we couldn't afford a few years ago. We didn't go anywhere with him. We ended up getting rid of him, and we thought he'd be the answer to keep us in the postseason forever. And it didn't work. We had players who were aging in Jimmy Rollins, Chase Utley, Ryan Howard, and the whole thing fell apart. I just hope we don't get fool's gold here and go after Bryant and have Boris rape us again. Yeah, maybe win a World Series and then hit rock bottom again. The question really is, the question really is here, is another world championship worth it? There are a lot of people would say, yeah. What do you get instead? Well, a lot of years being competitive in the postseason, but never really getting the brass ring. I don't know. My gut tells me that Bryant just isn't worth it. We have got to concentrate on starting pitching. And that means you certainly can't give up whatever we got left in the minor leagues in terms of the pitching. And we damn well better go after a veteran, experienced pitcher. I'm sorry, you're going to say something about Papelbon?
Well, I was going to say Papelbon's personality cannot be compared to Bryant's personality. Papelbon is a known, troubled personality, or he's difficult to work with. Bryant's just the opposite. So in that sense, you won't have any trouble. Would Scott Boras give you trouble in 2 years? Absolutely. And so you may be getting him for 2 years, and then off he goes, unless he loves Philly. He loves, his teammates, which is distinctly possible. But I think, looking at your roster, pitching is, like you said, is weak and questionable. I mean, as a Cubs fan, we love Jake Arrieta and what he did for the Cubs while he was with the Cubs. But he's gotten old, and he's gotten a little worn out. So he's your number 5 starter. And, I don't know who your number 3 and 4 starters are, if they're reliable or not, but you'll need to upgrade certainly those 2 positions, your number 3 and 4 starters, if you're going to contend with the Braves, who are looking pretty good, and Washington, and the rest of the National League. I mean, my gosh, the Dodgers are loaded up again.
Right.
In the Central, not only have the Cubs kind of stayed pat, but also Milwaukee has stayed. Actually, they've lost a little bit of talent, and the Cardinals have stayed pat. It's the Reds that have improved themselves. So now you have, the Reds have always languished in last place, so now you've got 4 teams that could be vying for first place, so that's going to be a competitive division. And maybe only 87 or 88 wins will win the division. You never know. In which case, the Cubs may be right there. And so they may be in a wait-and-see mode and just wait for the trading deadline before they make any moves. So, it'll be it's always interesting every year, right?
Oh, definitely. To your point about Bryant, though, let me just kind of correct what I said. I wasn't referring to Papelbon. I wasn't referring to Papelbon or Bryant as a bad egg personality. Clearly, he's a good citizen, and Papelbon was not. But the reason the Phillies got Papelbon is because in 2012 and 2013, we could have been in the postseason. We had a lousy bullpen and no closer. And Ruben Amaro, then the general manager, thought that signing Papelbon to a long-term deal was going to solve that question. Well, it didn't, and the whole team went south. And that's what I'm saying. I mean, I think the Phillies sometimes look for a quick fix in these super signings, like Harper, and now they're looking at a Bryant. But that ties up a lot of payroll. And, let us not forget that there have been teams that have done the same thing and just fallen apart, completely. And that happens in any sport.
And the Cubs are right at that cusp. The Cubs
are
at the cusp of, are they going to fall apart? They've been in the playoffs every year now since, the year before. What has it been? 5 years in a row they've been in the playoffs, but they're declining. They're seeing their championship window slipping away from them. And with each year after 2016, they have been in the playoffs, but worse. And they didn't do it this past year. I think I said 5 years in a row. I think it was 4 years. But so they're getting kind of worse. They've just hired a new manager, David Ross, who was the leader of the team back in 2016. And one can argue him and the other catcher, Montero, were the 2 leaders in the clubhouse. They both left after 2016, and look what happened.
Right.
That Joe Madden is not the type of manager to kick you in the rear end to get you going. He's the kind of hands-off kind of, don't worry, they'll take care of themselves. They're professionals. Well, I think a few of the Cubs were resting on their laurels. They're young. They thought probably this happened in 2016. It will happen again. It hasn't. And David Ross, the new manager, may be able to kick them in the rear and get them going because they respect him as a former player, but also as a disciplinarian too, and they will respect that. So I think that's what's needed many times in baseball, that fine line between respecting players and giving them the incentive to succeed. It's interesting how these things play out from year to year.
And then again, in Philadelphia, you have a similar situation. Gabe Kapler, the Phillies manager the last 2 years, was a disaster. I'm glad he's in San Francisco. Good riddance. Joe Girardi, Kapler did not kick the players in the ass when they needed it. And Joe Girardi's going to do that. In fact, the rub on Joe Girardi is that he wears on players after a while, but it takes them over 5, 6, 7 years to do it. What the Phillies need now is a good, swift kick in the ass, and we need, and apparently Girardi feels going into the season, he can work with, or the new pitching coach can work with, those number 3 and 4 starters who are going to be Vince Velasquez and Zach Eflin to at least make them 500 pitchers. And if that's the case, then maybe we could get a wild card. Who knows? But you're right. Stay tuned for both of these organizations because it's going to be an interesting 2020 campaign. We've been speaking with Chicago Cubs historian Bill Vaselopulos about the possibility of the Phillies trading for all-star third baseman Kris Bryant. Thanks for joining us on the podcast, Lopo, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.